Hello, fellow grave crawlers, and welcome to part 2 of Reconstruction, America After the Civil War. Part 2 picks up right where part 1 left off, as African American men gain the right to vote. It allows for the creation and building of an African American presence in U.S. Congress, especially across the South. South Carolina, with its almost 60% African American population and majority African American House of Representatives, becomes the African American seat of power. It's there that legislators establish an entire public system in a way that hadn't been seen in the South before. That system included public schools, hospitals, and a public welfare system. The public schools are especially hailed because during this time, any education, even elementary, had to be paid for. So for the first time, African Americans would be allowed to attend school. Once the other southern states saw how beneficial the system was, they adopted it for their states as well. However, despite the public schools being open to all races, many whites did not want to send their kids to school with African American kids, and many African American parents did not trust white teachers to educate and treat their kids fairly. So this created a serious demand for African American teachers. In order to meet that demand, African American governments, churches, and missionary organizations established African American colleges and universities in the South in order to provide the higher education necessary. Howard University, Claflin University, Fish University, Bennett College, Morehouse College, and Hampton Institute were some of the earliest establishments. Along with higher education opportunities, African Americans also had the first time ever chance to become more economically independent. They could finally buy land to live and or farm on, and they could even buy land to set up businesses to do commerce. As a result, African American communities began to form, as well as African American business districts. Of course, the Southern Democrats are seeing all of this Republican-fueled African American progress and hating it with a passionate fury. So in an attempt to regain their political power and reinforce white supremacy, they get drastic and decide to turn to terrorism. Ku Klux Klan attacks go on the rise. They descend on African American communities under the cover of hood and night and destroy property, as well as rape, beat, lynch, or outright shoot the African American citizens. And to drive the point home to the white Southerners sympathetic to the Union cause and the Republican Party, the Ku Klux Klan targets them as well. The acts of terror reach such a fever pitch that it gains the attention of U.S. Congress. And in 1871, to document the violence, they launched one of the most extensive investigations in U.S. history, known as the Ku Klux Klan hearings. African Americans from all walks of life, from political to everyman, come forward to give their statements. It reveals not just the horrible acts of violence, bribery, and extortion, but also reveals the identities of the many attackers, who weren't some old backwoods psychos, but Southern white men of power and prestige. It leads to U.S. Congress passing a series of enforcement acts to address the crisis. The third of which is known as the Ku Klux Klan Act. This act gave the federal government the power to directly intervene on the situation. And in 1870, federal troops are deployed to all Southern states to act as the authoritative law enforcement. Many arrests were made and convictions handed out, as the perpetrators could no longer hide behind a Democratic or sympathetic judge who would rather send an African American to jail for something they didn't do long before they'd send a white individual to jail for something they did do. It spelled the end of the Ku Klux Klan and any further acts of terror on their behalf. 1870 also marked the year of death for Robert E. Lee and caused an outpouring of grief, sorrow, and nostalgia from many of the white Southerners who'd hailed him as a hero. And the reason why many white Southerners hailed Robert E. Lee as a hero was because he was their physical embodiment of the things that they admired most: manly courage, Christian values, devotion to those underneath him, i.e. his soldiers, and a type of paternalism towards enslaved people. They believed in his idea that the Confederacy and their ways were not wrong, and that losing the war didn't make them wrong. It just meant that they were forced to comply with the Union's way of doing things instead of their own. This is where the idea of the lost cause comes from, and will be the subject of a book of the same name by Edward A. Pollard. 1872 marked the re-election of Ulysses S. Grant as President of the United States, but it also was the beginning of the divide in the Republican Party. Various scandals came to light, exposing corruption, such as money laundering, amongst certain members of U.S. Congress. And to know that that happened while a Republican president was in control did not sit well with Republican supporters. It led to the creation of liberal Republicans as a separation from conservative Republicans. And it led to the belief that Reconstruction itself was inherently corrupt. Thus, negative propaganda began spreading in newspapers and books that painted African Americans from all walks of life as barbaric, incompetent buffoons. It asked white America if they were really going to allow what were slaves just a few years before to act in any part of the government or even be a part of polite society at all. It spread the idea that Reconstruction had failed, that the Republicans should just give up and cut their losses, remove support and enforcement from the South, and leave the Negro to those who knew them best. Emboldened by this change of face, the Democratic and anti-Reconstruction white Southerners decided to double down on their acts of terror against African Americans. New organized white supremacist groups formed, such as Louisiana's White League and North Carolina's and Mississippi's Red Shirts, in hopes that their continued acts would drive the North, who was already growing weary of the ever-growing price for peace in the South, out for good. When the Panic of 1873 left both the North and the South in an economic crisis, the Democratic Party took advantage by promising to end the crisis as well as Reconstruction in the South. This sounded like music to the ears of many white Americans, both North and South. And when they went to the voting polls, they voted in a Democratic majority to replace the Republican one in U.S. Congress. Knowing that their time to do so was running out, the remaining pro-Reconstruction Republicans presented a new civil rights bill that prohibited discrimination in public transportation, juries, and public accommodations, which included everything from banks to restaurants to public education. But both Northern and Southern Democrats railed against the bill, stating that it was unconstitutional and that the U.S. government had no business telling any proprietor who they could and could not give service to. But after a powerful rebuttal speech given by Republican Robert Brown Elliott, the Civil Rights Bill is passed and put into action. By the time the presidential election comes around in 1876, pressure to drop Reconstruction is so heavy that both the Democratic and Republican candidates make it a part of their promise to do so if elected. And after a tense election, fueled by more terrorist attacks in the South to make sure a Democrat gets elected as president, Republican Rutherford B. Hayes is elected as president. The only reason all hell doesn't break loose on the Democratic side is because Hayes promises white Southerners that he will lead the South to conduct its own affairs unimpeded, and that the Negro problem will be its to solve. And shortly after entering office, he makes good on that promise by effectively bringing to an end the entire Reconstruction project and withdrawing federal troops from all parts of the South. And it's on this dark note that Part 2 of Reconstruction comes to an end.